August 18th, 1492, Rome. Inside the Apostolic Palace, the College of Cardinals gathered to elect a new pope. The previous pope, Innocent VIII, had died a week earlier, and the church needed a leader. Among the candidates was a Spanish cardinal named Rodrigo Borgia. He was 61 years old, wealthy, and utterly corrupt. Rodrigo had spent decades accumulating power in Rome. He had fathered at least 7 children, despite being a cardinal of the church, supposedly celibate. He lived openly with his mistress. He sold church offices to the highest bidder. He was everything a holy man should not be. But Rodrigo Borgia was also brilliant, charismatic, and ruthless, and he wanted to be pope. The papal election was supposed to be guided by prayer and the Holy Spirit. In reality, it was an auction. Rodrigo spent a fortune bribing cardinals. He promised them money, land, castles, and positions of power. He sent mule loads of silver to their homes. He made deals, threats, and promises. One by one, the cardinals agreed to vote for him. On August 11, 1492, the white smoke rose from the Sistine Chapel. Rodrigo Borgia had been elected pope. He took the name Alexander VI. The people of Rome were shocked. A man with children, mistresses, and a reputation for corruption had become the vicar of Christ. But Alexander didn't care. He now had absolute power over the Catholic Church, and he intended to use it. For the next 11 years, Alexander VI and his family would turn the Vatican into a den of corruption, murder, and scandal. They would poison rivals, seduce enemies, and commit incest. They would make the papacy a family business and the church a criminal enterprise. This is the story of the Borgias, the most corrupt, most infamous family in the history of the Catholic Church, a dynasty built on bribery, poison, and blood. It's a story of popes who fathered children, cardinals who killed their rivals, and a family that believed power was the only virtue that mattered. This is the poisoned legacy of the Borgia family empire. The Borgia family did not start in Rome. They came from Spain, specifically from the Kingdom of Valencia. Their original name was Borja. They were minor nobility, ambitious and cunning, but not particularly powerful. In the early 1400s, one member of the family, Alfonso de Borja, entered the church. He was intelligent and politically skilled. He rose through the ranks, becoming a bishop, then a cardinal. In 1455, something extraordinary happened. Alfonso de Borja was elected pope. He took the name Calixtus III. It was a shocking elevation for a relatively obscure Spanish family. But Alfonso, now Pope Calixtus, immediately set about using his power to benefit his relatives. This was not unusual. Nepotism was standard practice in Renaissance Italy. Popes routinely appointed their nephews and relatives to positions of power. The word nepotism itself comes from the Italian nipote, meaning nephew. Pope Calixtus appointed his nephew, Rodrigo Borgia, as a cardinal. Rodrigo was only 25 years old. He had little theological training and less interest in spiritual matters. But he was smart, ambitious, and utterly loyal to his family. And that was all that mattered. When Calixtus died in 1458, Rodrigo was already entrenched in the Vatican, and he spent the next 34 years accumulating wealth, power, and influence, waiting for his chance to become pope. Rodrigo Borgia was not a holy man. He made no pretense of celibacy or piety. In 1460, while still a cardinal, Rodrigo attended a party in Siena that became so scandalous that Pope Pius II, his predecessor, wrote him a furious letter. The Pope described how Rodrigo and other cardinals had danced with women, engaged in licentious behavior, and conducted themselves in a manner unworthy of your position. Rodrigo didn't care. He continued living openly with his mistress, Fagnozza de Catane, a Roman noblewoman. Together they had 4 children who would become infamous: Cesare, Juan, Lucrezia, and Joffre. These children grew up in luxury, educated and groomed for power. They were Rodrigo's greatest investment, and when he became pope, they became his greatest weapons. Rodrigo also had 3 other children from earlier relationships. though they played smaller roles in his schemes. By the time Rodrigo was elected Pope in 1492, he had a ready-made dynasty. His children were adults, beautiful, intelligent, and completely loyal to him. He was about to unleash them on Renaissance Italy. Pope Alexander VI's first act was to legitimize his children. Officially, as a cardinal, and now as Pope, he wasn't supposed to have children at all. But Alexander issued papal bulls declaring that his children were legitimate and entitled to inherit titles and property. He also immediately began appointing them to positions of power. His eldest son, Cesare Borgia, was made a cardinal at 18, the youngest cardinal in the history of the church. Cesare had no interest in religion, but the position gave him wealth and influence. His second son, Juan, was made Duke of Gandia and given command of the papal armies. Juan was vain, incompetent, and jealous of his older brother. His daughter Lucrezia was only 12 when Alexander became pope, but she would soon become the most valuable pawn in Alexander's political games. And his youngest son, Joffrey, was married off to create alliances. The Borgias were a family business, and the business was power. Alexander's first major move was to forge an alliance with the most powerful kingdom in Europe, Spain. In 1493, he issued a papal bull dividing the newly discovered Americas between Spain and Portugal. This wasn't a religious decision, it was a political favour to Spain's monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. In return, Spain supported Alexander's ambitions in Italy. Italy at the time was a patchwork of city-states, kingdoms and duchies, constantly at war with each other. Milan, Venice, Florence, Naples all competed for territory and influence, and foreign powers, France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, constantly meddled. Alexander wanted the Borgia family to carve out its own territory in central Italy, and to do that, he needed armies. But there was a problem. The Pope's main military commander, Juan Borgia, was a disaster. He was arrogant, incompetent, and hated by his own troops. His brother Cesare watched with growing frustration as Juan bungled military campaigns and squandered opportunities. Then, in June 1497, something happened that changed everything. Juan Borgia disappeared. On the night of June 14th, 1497, Juan Borgia attended a dinner with his brother Cesare and several other guests. After the meal, Juan and Cesare left together on horseback. At some point, they separated. Cesare returned home. Juan did not. The next morning, Juan's servants reported him missing. Pope Alexander was frantic. He sent searchers throughout Rome. 8 days later, Juan's body was found in the Tiber River. He had been stabbed 9 times. His throat was cut. His body was weighed down with stones. Alexander was devastated. He wept openly. He spoke of resigning the papacy. He couldn't understand who would murder his beloved son. But most of Rome had a pretty good idea. Cesare. Cesare and Juan had hated each other. They competed for their father's favour, for military command, for power. And Cesare, brilliant and ruthless, had grown tired of watching his incompetent brother fail. Did Cesare murder Juan? No confession was ever made. No trial ever held. But the rumours never stopped, and within months, Cesare had taken Juan's place as the Pope's military commander. After Juan's death, Cesare Borgia dropped all pretense of being a man of the church. In 1498, he resigned as cardinal, an almost unprecedented move. He declared that he wanted to be a soldier, not a priest. Alexander, still grieving for Juan but pragmatic as ever, supported his decision. He needed a general. And Cesare was brilliant. Alexander arranged for Cesare to marry Charlotte d'Albret, a French princess. The marriage was part of a deal with King Louis XII of France. In exchange, France would support Cesare's military campaigns in Italy. Cesare now had a title, Duke of Valentinois, a French army at his disposal, and his father's blessing. He was 23 years old, and he was about to become the most feared man in Italy. Between 1499 and 1503, Cesare Borgia launched a series of ruthless military campaigns across central Italy. His goal was to conquer the Romagna, a region of small cities and petty rulers in northeastern Italy, and create a unified state under Borgia control. City by city, Cesare attacked. He used a combination of military force, bribery, betrayal, and terror. He was extraordinarily effective. When he arrived at a city, he would offer the local ruler a choice: submit peacefully or be destroyed. Most submitted. Those who resisted were crushed. Cesare also used marriage and alliances to consolidate power. His sister, Lucrezia, was married off 3 times, each marriage a political tool. Her first marriage to Giovanni Sforza was annulled when the alliance was no longer useful. Rumours spread that Giovanni had been impotent, a humiliating claim designed to justify the annulment. Her second marriage, to Alfonso of Aragon, ended in a murder. Alfonso was attacked on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, stabbed multiple times. He survived, barely. But weeks later, while recovering, he was strangled in his bed. Everyone knew Cesare had ordered it. Alfonso's family had become inconvenient. The marriage was no longer useful. Lucrezia, only 20 years old, was devastated. But she obeyed her father and brother. She married again, this time to Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duke of Ferrara. Lucrezia was not just a pawn, though. She was intelligent, educated, and politically astute. While her father and brother waged war, Lucrezia often governed Rome in their absence. She signed documents, met with diplomats, and managed the papal administration. She was as much a Borgia as Cesare, just with fewer opportunities for violence. Cesare's conquests in the Romagna were shockingly successful. Within 3 years he controlled a dozen cities. He was hailed as a brilliant general. But he was also feared. Stories spread of his cruelty. In Siena, when the local governor proved unpopular, Cesare had him cut in half and displayed in the town square, a message to other cities. In Senigallia, Cesare invited several rebellious condottieri, mercenary leaders, to a meeting. He greeted them warmly, promised reconciliation, and then had them all strangled. Niccolò Machiavelli, the famous political theorist, met Cesare during this period. He was both horrified and impressed. Cesare became the model for Machiavelli's book The Prince, a guide to ruthless, effective leadership. Machiavelli wrote, "Cesare Borgia was considered cruel. Nonetheless, his cruelty restored order to the Romagna, unified it, and brought it peace. Cesare believed that cruelty properly applied was a virtue, that fear was more effective than love, that power was the only thing that mattered, and for a time he was right. But Cesare's empire depended entirely on his father's position as Pope. The Pope controlled the Vatican's wealth, its armies, and its diplomatic influence. Without Alexander, Cesare was just another Italian warlord, and Alexander was getting old. In August 1503, both Alexander and Cesare fell ill after attending a banquet. Some historians believe they were poisoned, possibly by wine intended for a rival that they accidentally drank themselves. Others believe it was malaria, which was rampant in Rome that summer. Either way, both men were near death. Alexander, 72 years old and already in poor health, didn't survive. On August 18th, 1503, Pope Alexander VI died. Cesare, younger and stronger, survived. But barely, and with his father's death everything collapsed. The moment Alexander died, chaos erupted in Rome. Cardinals who had been bribed or intimidated by Alexander saw their chance. Families that had been dispossessed by the Borgias demanded their property back. Enemies Cesare had made in the Romagna rose in rebellion. Cesare, still weak and bedridden, tried to hold on to power. He sent troops to secure key positions. He threatened cardinals. He tried to influence the papal election, but he was too weak, and the cardinals had learned their lesson. They would not elect another Borgia pope. Instead, they elected Francesco Todeschini Piccolomini, who took the name Pius III. He was elderly and died within a month. Then they elected Giuliano della Rovere, who became Pope Julius II. Giuliano had been Alexander's greatest enemy. He hated the Borgias. Cesare tried to negotiate with Julius. He offered to hand over his fortresses in the Romagna in exchange for safe passage out of Rome. Julius agreed and then betrayed him. Cesare was arrested and imprisoned. His empire crumbled. The cities he had conquered rebelled. His allies abandoned him. Within months, everything Cesare had built was gone. Cesare Borgia spent the next few years as a prisoner and a fugitive. He was transferred to Spain, where he was held in various prisons. In 1506, he escaped and fled to the Kingdom of Navarre, where his brother-in-law was king. Cesare hoped to rebuild, to raise an army, to reclaim his lost territories, but he never got the chance. On March 12th, 1507, Cesare was fighting in a minor siege at Viana in northern Spain. He was 31 years old, a shadow of his former self. During the battle, he was surrounded by enemy soldiers. He fought fiercely, but he was outnumbered. He was stabbed multiple times and left to die on the battlefield. His body was stripped naked. He was buried in an unmarked grave. The man who had terrorized Italy, who had conquered a dozen cities, who had been called the most dangerous man in Europe, died alone, unmourned, in a small Spanish town. Cesare Borgia's empire lasted less than 5 years, and it died with him. Lucrezia Borgia outlived her father and brother, but her life was forever shaped by them. After Cesare's fall, Lucrezia remained in Ferrara, married to Alfonso d'Este. She had no political power now. She was simply a duchess, mother, and patron of the arts. She gave birth to several children. She supported poets, musicians, and artists. She became known for her piety and charity. But the rumours never stopped. For centuries, Lucrezia was depicted as a poisoner, a seductress, and a participant in her family's crimes. The accusations were largely false. There is no credible evidence that Lucrezia ever poisoned anyone. The stories of incest with her father and brother, repeated endlessly in later histories, were likely propaganda spread by the Borgias' enemies. Lucrezia was a victim of her family's reputation. She was used as a political tool, married off 3 times, and forced to live with the scandal of being a Borgia. She died in 1519 at age 39 during childbirth. Her last words, reportedly, were prayers for forgiveness. In death, Lucrezia finally escaped her family's shadow. The Borgias left behind a poisoned legacy, literally and figuratively. They were accused of using poison to eliminate rivals. The Borgia poison became legendary, a mysterious substance that caused slow, agonizing death. Some claimed it was arsenic. Others said it was a secret formula known only to the Borgias. Still others believed it was simply a myth, that the Borgias killed their enemies through conventional means, and the poison stories were exaggerations. Whatever the truth, the Borgias became synonymous with treachery, poison, and murder. But they were also remarkably successful for a time. Alexander VI, for all his corruption, was an effective pope. He expanded the church's influence, negotiated major treaties, and strengthened the papal states. Cesare Borgia, for all his cruelty, was a brilliant military strategist. He conquered and unified the Romagna, creating a state that lasted decades after his death, just not under Borgia control. And Lucrezia, despite being used as a pawn, became a respected duchess and patron of Renaissance art and culture. The Borgias were monsters, but they were also human, complex, contradictory. They believed power was the only virtue, that the strong survive and the weak perish, that loyalty to family justified any crime. And for a brief bloody period at the turn of the 16th century, they were right. The question that haunted Renaissance Italy, and still fascinates historians today, is this: were the Borgias really as bad as their reputation suggests? The answer is complicated. Much of what we know about the Borgias comes from their enemies. Papal rivals, dispossessed nobles, and hostile chroniclers spread stories, some true, some exaggerated, some entirely fabricated. For example, the infamous Banquet of Chestnuts in 1491, supposedly an orgy hosted by Pope Alexander in the Vatican, is described in only one source, the diary of Johannes Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies. And even his account is suspiciously sensational. Similarly, the accusations of incest between Alexander, Cesare, and Lucrezia appear in hostile sources but lack credible evidence. But there is no question that the Borgias were corrupt. Alexander did bribe his way to the papacy. Cesare did murder rivals. The family did use poison, though probably less often than the legend suggests. The Borgias were not unique in their corruption. Renaissance Italy was full of ruthless families, the Sforzas, the Medicis, the Orsinis. The difference was that the Borgias were foreigners, Spanish interlopers, who dared to treat the papacy as a family business. And they paid for it with their reputation. Pope Alexander VI's pontificate was also a turning point for the Catholic Church. His blatant corruption, selling church offices, fathering children living with mistresses, shocked even Renaissance standards, and it fueled the growing discontent with the Church that would explode into the Protestant Reformation just 14 years after his death. Martin Luther, who nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in 1517, specifically cited papal corruption as a justification for breaking with Rome. The Borgias didn't cause the Reformation, but they embodied everything that reformers hated about the Catholic Church: greed, nepotism, immorality, and the belief that spiritual authority could be bought and sold. In that sense, the Borgias' legacy extends far beyond their own crimes. They helped destabilize the institution they claimed to serve. After the Borgias fell, the papacy tried to reform itself. Pope Julius II, Alexander's successor, was a warrior pope who spent more time on battlefields than in chapels. But he also commissioned some of the greatest art in history: Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, Raphael's frescoes. Later popes instituted reforms to reduce corruption and nepotism, though these were only partially successful. The Council of Trent, held between 1545 and 1563, enacted sweeping reforms in response to the Protestant threat. Nepotism was officially condemned. Clerical celibacy was reinforced. Standards for bishops and priests were raised. But the damage was done. The Church had lost millions of followers to Protestantism, and the Borgia name had become a symbol of everything wrong with the old Church. The Borgia family did not disappear entirely after Cesare's death. Rodrigo's descendants continued to hold minor titles in Spain and Italy. Some became respectable nobles, others faded into obscurity. One branch of the family produced a saint. Francis Borgia, Rodrigo's great-grandson, became a Jesuit priest and was canonized in 1671. He spent his life trying to atone for his family's sins. It's a fitting irony, the family that produced one of the most corrupt popes in history also produced a saint. But for most people, the name Borgia will forever be associated with poison, murder, and scandal. The Borgias have fascinated artists, writers, and historians for over 500 years. Victor Hugo wrote a play about them. Alexandre Dumas wrote a novella. Machiavelli based The Prince on Cesare. In modern times, the Borgias have been the subject of countless books, films, and television series. They are portrayed as glamorous villains, beautiful, intelligent, and utterly immoral. But these portrayals often obscure the human beings beneath the legend. Rodrigo Borgia was a man who loved his children, too much perhaps. He was willing to corrupt the church, murder rivals, and betray allies to advance their interests. Cesare Borgia was a brilliant strategist trapped by his father's mortality. He built an empire in 5 years and watched it collapse in months. Lucrezia Borgia was a woman born into a family that saw her as a commodity. She was used, married off, and slandered, but she survived and carved out a life of her own. They were not heroes, but they were not one-dimensional villains either. The Borgias also raise uncomfortable questions about power and morality. Is it better to be feared than loved? Cesare Borgia thought so. Machiavelli agreed. Is loyalty to family more important than loyalty to principles? The Borgias believed yes. They would lie, cheat, steal, and kill, but never betray each other. Until they did. Is corruption justified if it achieves results? Alexander expanded the church's influence and created a brief period of stability in central Italy. But at what cost? These questions don't have easy answers. And that's why the Borgias remained compelling. They embodied the Renaissance at its most brilliant and its most brutal. An age of incredible art, culture, and innovation, but also of violence, treachery, and moral decay. One of the most enduring myths about the Borgias is the Borgia ring, supposedly a hollow ring filled with poison that could be used to discreetly kill dinner guests. The story goes that the Borgias would shake hands with rivals, secretly scratching them with the poisoned ring, and days later the victim would die mysteriously. It's a great story. It's also probably false. No such ring has ever been found. No contemporary source describes it. The legend appears to have been invented centuries after the Borgias' deaths, another example of how their reputation grew more sinister with time. But the fact that people believed it shows how thoroughly the Borgias had come to embody treachery and poison. The fall of the Borgias was swift and total. Within a decade of Alexander's death, the family had lost everything. Their palaces were seized, their fortresses were taken, their allies abandoned them. Cesare died on a Spanish battlefield. Lucrezia lived quietly in Ferrara. The younger Borgia children faded into obscurity. It was a dramatic collapse for a family that had seemed invincible just years before. But that's the nature of power in Renaissance Italy. It was fluid, unstable, built on alliances and armies that could evaporate overnight. The Borgias understood this. They knew their power was temporary. That's why they were so ruthless. They had to be. They had a brief window to build a dynasty, and they tried to seize it with both hands. They failed, but they came closer than most. What if Cesare had survived? What if Alexander had lived another 10 years? Could the Borgias have established a lasting dynasty? Possibly. Cesare was talented enough. If he had consolidated the Romagna and built a stable state, if he had produced heirs, if he had outlived his enemies, the history of Italy might be very different. But history is full of what-ifs. The Borgias fell because they made enemies faster than they made allies, because their power depended entirely on holding the papacy, because they were foreigners in a world that valued native Italian families, and because ultimately they pushed too far. They were too corrupt, too violent, too blatant. Renaissance Italians accepted a certain level of vice in their leaders, but the Borgias exceeded it. The legacy of the Borgias is visible today in Rome. The Vatican still stands, of course. The Sistine Chapel, commissioned by Alexander's predecessor but completed during his reign, remains one of the greatest artistic achievements in history. The Castel Sant'Angelo, where the Borgias imprisoned enemies and stored treasure, is now a museum. And scattered throughout Rome are Borgia crests, the bull, their family symbol, carved in stone on buildings and monuments. These reminders are fading. Time erodes stone, but the stories endure. The Borgias have become mythical, larger than life, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and moral corruption. Pope Alexander VI once said, "I have lived as a sinner, but I will die as a Christian." He was lying, of course. He lived as a sinner and died as one too. But the quote reveals something important. Alexander knew he was corrupt. He knew his actions were wrong. He simply didn't care. Power mattered more than salvation. Family mattered more than virtue. And in the ruthless world of Renaissance Italy, that philosophy almost worked. Almost. The Borgia story is ultimately a tragedy. Not a tragedy in the sense of innocent victims. The Borgias were far from innocent. But a tragedy in the classical sense. A story of ambition, hubris, and inevitable downfall. Rodrigo Borgia clawed his way to the papacy through bribery and cunning. He wielded absolute power. He made his children into princes. And then he died. And everything he built collapsed. Cesare Borgia conquered a dozen cities and dreamed of building a kingdom. But without his father's protection, he was nothing. He died on a muddy battlefield, alone and forgotten. Lucrezia Borgia, the most innocent of the family, spent her life as a political pawn. She was married 3 times, widowed twice, one husband murdered on her brother's orders. She lived with scandal and died in obscurity. The Borgias reached for greatness. They came tantalizingly close, and then they lost everything. That's the essence of tragedy. 500 years after their fall, the Borgias remain infamous. Their name is synonymous with corruption, poison, and intrigue. They are the villains of Renaissance history, beautiful, intelligent, and utterly immoral. But they were also a product of their time, an age when power was the only currency that mattered, when loyalty to family trumped all other virtues, when the strong survived and the weak perished. The Borgias played by the rules of their world, and for a brief moment they dominated it. They poisoned their rivals, they murdered their enemies, they bribed, seduced, and betrayed their way to the top. And for 11 years they ruled the Catholic Church itself. Then they fell, swiftly, totally, irreversibly. Their empire lasted barely a decade, but their legend has lasted 5 centuries, and that, perhaps, is the ultimate Borgia achievement. They failed to build a lasting dynasty, but they succeeded in becoming immortal. Poisoned legacy indeed. This has been Bloodline Chronicles.